The wrought iron gates of Forest Lawn Memorial Park stood silent against the midnight sky, their shadows stretching across manicured lawns like dark fingers reaching for something just beyond their grasp. For 14 years, those gates had guarded one of entertainment's most precious secrets, a mystery that consumed millions of hearts worldwide. Inside those hallowed grounds, beneath polished marble and carefully tended flowers, lay the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson. But what nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly imagined, was that his final resting place contained something extraordinary, something that would shatter everything the world thought it knew about the legendary performer. Detective Sarah Martinez had spent 3 decades working cases that most people only read about in thriller novels. She'd uncovered corruption at the highest levels, exposed international smuggling rings, and brought justice to victims who'd waited years for their stories to be heard. But nothing, absolutely nothing in her distinguished career had prepared her for the phone call she received on that humid June evening in 2023. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Freeman, a maintenance worker at Forest Lawn who sounded absolutely terrified. Marcus had been performing routine inspection work in the Holy Terrace section of the cemetery, the exclusive area where Michael Jackson's crypt resided within the Great Mausoleum. During a standard structural assessment required after recent earthquakes had rattled Southern California, he'd noticed something peculiar. A hairline crack had appeared in the marble facing of the wall near Jackson's resting place, and through that tiny fissure, Marcus had glimpsed something metallic, something that definitely shouldn't have been there. His hands had trembled as he'd pulled out his phone to call the authorities, knowing that what he discovered could change everything. Sarah arrived at Forest Lawn within the hour, accompanied by a forensic team and representatives from the Jackson estate. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone present understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about investigating an anomaly in a celebrity's grave. This was about potentially uncovering secrets that one of the most famous men in history had taken to his grave, secrets that he'd wanted to remain hidden from the world forever. As they approached the Great Mausoleum, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She'd learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that they were about to uncover something monumental. The mausoleum's interior was breathtaking even under these stressful circumstances. Stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across pristine floors, and the air held a peculiar combination of flowers, marble dust, and history that all old buildings seemed to possess. Marcus led them to the exact location, pointing with a shaking finger at the crack he'd discovered. Sarah pulled out a specialized camera and carefully inserted its lens into the opening. What appeared on the monitor made everyone in the room gasp collectively. Behind the marble facing, nestled in a deliberately created cavity, sat a large titanium box. Its surface was covered in what appeared to be hand-etched designs, intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story all their own. But more importantly, the box bore an unmistakable inscription in elegant script that read, "For the world to know when the time is right." The words were followed by Michael Jackson's distinctive signature and a date, June 24th, 2009, exactly 1 day before his death. The legal implications were staggering. The Jackson family's attorneys immediately began arguing about jurisdiction, ownership, and privacy rights. But Sarah knew that once something like this came to light, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The world would demand answers. Fans who'd mourned Michael for over a decade deserved to know what their idol had felt was important enough to hide in such an elaborate and permanent way. After hours of heated discussion, a decision was reached. They would carefully extract the box and examine its contents under controlled conditions, with representatives from all interested parties present. The extraction process took 2 full days. Engineers had to be brought in to ensure that removing the box wouldn't compromise the structural integrity of the mausoleum or disturb Michael's actual resting place. Every movement was documented, every action recorded on video. The media had somehow gotten wind that something significant was happening at Forest Lawn, and news vans lined the streets outside the cemetery gates. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was unfolding inside those protected walls. When the titanium box finally emerged from its hiding place, Sarah was struck by its weight. It took 2 people to carry it carefully to the secure examination room that had been set up in the mausoleum's administrative building. The box measured approximately 2 feet long, 18 inches wide, and a foot deep. Its construction was clearly custom-made, designed to withstand time and the elements. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that whatever lay inside would be preserved perfectly, waiting for this exact moment of discovery. As Sarah prepared to open the box, she looked around at the assembled group. There were members of the Jackson family, some with tears already streaming down their faces. There were lawyers, cemetery officials, forensic experts, and authentication specialists. Everyone held their breath, united in anticipation of what they were about to witness. Michael Jackson had been known for his perfectionism, his attention to detail, and his love of mystery and drama. Whatever he'd hidden in this box, it would be spectacular, meaningful, and probably earth-shattering. The locks on the box were complex but not impossible. Sarah's team worked methodically, treating this like the valuable archaeological find it essentially was. Finally, with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent room, the seal broke. Sarah lifted the lid slowly, revealing contents that made even a seasoned investigator's heart skip a beat. Inside lay stacks of journals, dozens of them, all in Michael's distinctive handwriting. There were photographs, some in black and white, others in color, showing moments from Michael's life that the public had never seen. There were letters, sealed and addressed to various people, some living, some long dead. And most intriguingly, there were dozens of master recordings, original tapes labeled with song titles that nobody had ever heard before. But it was a single envelope lying on top of everything else that commanded everyone's attention. It was addressed simply, to whoever finds this, and to the world. Sarah picked it up with gloved hands, her fingers barely steady as she carefully opened it, and began to read aloud the letter that would change everything the world thought it knew about Michael Jackson. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she began reading Michael Jackson's letter aloud, each word carefully handwritten in his distinctive flowing script. The room had become a cathedral of silence, every person present acutely aware that they were about to hear something that would ripple through history. The letter started simply enough, but its opening line sent chills down everyone's spine. If you're reading this, then I've been gone long enough for the truth to matter more than the legend. Michael's words flowed with a raw honesty that contrasted sharply with the carefully crafted public persona he'd maintained throughout his life. He wrote about the crushing weight of fame that had been placed on his shoulders when he was just a child, barely old enough to understand what it meant to be human, let alone to be extraordinary. He described watching his childhood disappear through limousine windows while other kids played in parks and went to regular schools. He wrote about the physical pain of his father's discipline, the psychological torture of never being good enough despite revolutionizing music before his 20th birthday. But these revelations, as heartbreaking as they were, served only as a foundation for something far more explosive. The letter went on to reveal that Michael had been secretly documenting everything throughout his entire career. Every conversation with powerful people in the entertainment industry, every suspicious business deal, every moment when he'd witnessed something that troubled his conscience. He wrote that he'd initially started keeping records to protect himself, to have evidence in case anyone ever tried to destroy him. But as the years passed and his collection of secrets grew, he realized he was sitting on information that exposed a network of corruption, manipulation, and abuse that stretched far beyond his own personal experiences. He'd witnessed things that implicated some of the most powerful people in entertainment, politics, and business. The most shocking revelation came in the letter's third paragraph. Michael wrote that his death had not been the simple medical tragedy that the world had been led to believe. While he stopped short of making direct accusations that could be easily disproven, he made it clear that he'd been under enormous pressure in the months leading up to his death. He'd known too much about too many powerful people. He'd been preparing to speak out about what he'd witnessed and experienced throughout his career. The coincidental timing of his death, he suggested, was something that deserved far more scrutiny than it had received. He wrote that he'd arranged for this box to be secretly installed in his mausoleum because he knew that if anything happened to him, his family would need protection, and the only insurance policy strong enough was the truth. Sarah set down the main letter with hands that had started shaking. But that was just the beginning. Inside the titanium box were 73 additional letters, each one addressed to a specific individual. Some were letters of forgiveness, written to people who'd hurt Michael over the years, explaining how he'd processed that pain and eventually found peace. Others were letters of love, written to his children, to his mother, to siblings, pouring out emotions he'd struggled to express during his lifetime. But the most significant letters were the ones addressed to public figures, people whose names everyone would recognize. These letters contained specific allegations, detailed accounts of conversations and incidents that had never been made public. One letter addressed to a former record executive detailed how Michael had witnessed that person systematically exploiting young artists, stealing their royalties through complex contract manipulation that left teenagers with millions in sales but thousands in debt. The letter included specific dates, locations, and even reproduced contract clauses that had been deliberately designed to be incomprehensible to young performers desperate for their big break. Michael wrote that he tried to speak up at the time but had been silenced by threats to his own career. He'd watched as artist after artist was chewed up and spit out by the industry machine, and his guilt over his silence had haunted him for decades. Another letter, addressed to a prominent Hollywood producer, contained even more disturbing allegations. Michael described parties he'd attended in the early days of his solo career, gatherings where he'd witnessed behavior that made his skin crawl. He wrote about young actors and performers being pressured into situations they clearly weren't comfortable with, about substances being slipped into drinks, about powerful men treating human beings like commodities to be traded and consumed. Michael explained that he'd left Hollywood's inner circle partly because he couldn't stomach what he was seeing, and he'd spent years trying to protect other young performers from similar fates. His own allegations of being targeted had been, in his words, a twisted kind of projection by people who were guilty of far worse. The Jackson family members in the room were experiencing a tornado of emotions. Some were crying, overwhelmed by the pain Michael had clearly carried in silence. Others were angry that he'd never shared these burdens with them while alive, that he'd felt so isolated despite being surrounded by family. But mostly, they were stunned by the weight of what they were learning. Michael hadn't just been the king of pop. He'd been a witness to decades of entertainment industry darkness, and he'd carefully documented everything. Sarah's forensic team began the painstaking process of authenticating each letter. Handwriting expert confirmed that every word had indeed been written by Michael Jackson. The paper was tested and dated, confirming that these documents had been created over a span of years, with the most recent entries dated just days before his death. The ink composition matched samples from Michael's known personal journals. There was absolutely no question about authenticity. These were Michael's real words, his real observations, his real accusations. As Sarah continued reading through the letters, patterns began to emerge. Michael had been incredibly careful about how he documented everything. He didn't just make accusations, he provided evidence. He kept receipts, contracts, photographs, and in some cases, recordings of conversations. He'd been building a case, creating a comprehensive archive of wrongdoing that spanned the entertainment industry. It became clear that Michael had intended this book to serve as both an insurance policy and potentially as a catalyst for a major investigation that could clean up some of the industry's darkest corners. One particularly poignant letter was addressed to his fans. In it, Michael thanked them for their love and support throughout his career, but he also apologized for not being able to be more open with them during his lifetime. He explained that the person they saw on stage was both completely real and carefully constructed. The dancing, the music, the humanitarian work, all of that came from his genuine heart. But the childlike persona, the bizarre behavior that had made him a tabloid fixture, some of that had been deliberately exaggerated to create a shield. He wrote that by making himself seem eccentric and vulnerable, he protected himself from being taken seriously as a threat by powerful people who had much to hide. They dismissed him as a strange, damaged celebrity rather than recognizing him as a careful observer who was documenting their secrets. The room's atmosphere grew heavier with each revelation. This wasn't just a collection of grievances from a troubled celebrity. This was a meticulously compiled archive of evidence that had the potential to trigger investigations, lawsuits, and possibly criminal charges. Some of the people Michael had written about were still alive and still powerful. Others had already passed away, but their legacies and the institutions they'd built remained influential. The question hanging in the air was obvious. What would be done with this information? Would it be suppressed to protect powerful interests, or would Michael's final wish, that the truth be revealed when the time was right, be honored? As the initial examination concluded, Sarah knew they'd only scratched the surface. The letters were just the beginning. The box also contained those journals, those photographs, and those mysterious recordings. Each element would need to be carefully examined and authenticated. But already, it was clear that Michael Jackson's hidden truth was going to force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about him, about the entertainment industry, and about the real price of fame. The following morning brought renewed energy to the investigation team assembled at Forest Lawn. While the letters had been shocking enough, everyone understood that the real treasures might lie in those dozens of master recordings that Michael had carefully preserved in his hidden vault. Music had been Michael's first language, the medium through which he'd expressed his deepest truths. Whatever was recorded on those tapes would likely reveal aspects of his soul that even his written words couldn't fully capture. Audio forensic specialist Dr. Raymond Chen arrived from Berkeley with equipment sophisticated enough to extract sound from nearly destroyed media. He'd worked on everything from recovering audio from the Watergate tapes to restoring recordings from early jazz legends. As he carefully examined the tapes in Michael's box, his experienced eyes widened with recognition. These weren't just any recordings. These were original master tapes, the kind that studios guarded like gold because they represented the purest, highest quality version of any recording. Each tape was labeled in Michael's handwriting with titles, dates, and in some cases, cryptic notes about the content. The first tape Dr. Chen prepared to play was labeled simply The Truth About Neverland, June 2003. The date was significant. It corresponded with a period just before the second round of allegations that had nearly destroyed Michael's life. As the tape began to play, Michael's voice filled the room, but this wasn't the soft, breathy speaking voice the public knew. This was raw, unfiltered, and absolutely clear. He'd recorded himself speaking directly into a microphone in what sounded like a private studio, probably late at night when he knew he wouldn't be disturbed. In the recording, Michael methodically explained the real purpose behind Neverland Ranch. He described how he created the estate specifically as a safe haven for sick and underprivileged children. He detailed the security measures he'd put in place to ensure that every visitor was chaperoned, every interaction documented. He explained the philosophy about childhood innocence and why he'd felt compelled to create a space where kids could be kids without judgment or expectation. But more importantly, he addressed why people had found his behavior suspicious. With painful honesty, he admitted that his own stolen childhood had left him unable to relate to adults in traditional ways. His closest friendships had always been with children because they didn't want anything from him except genuine connection. They didn't see him as a commodity or a stepping stone to success. The most devastating part of this recording came when Michael discussed the accusations themselves. He didn't go into specifics about the cases, respecting legal boundaries even in his private recording. But he talked about the emotional and psychological torture of being accused of the worst possible crime, of watching the media convict him before any evidence had been presented. He described the humiliation of the strip search, the violation of having his body photographed by strangers looking for identifying marks an accuser had described. He spoke about contemplating suicide during the darkest days of the trial, about the only thing keeping him alive being his children and his mother's pleading voice on the phone every morning. Sarah watched as several people in the room wiped away tears. The Michael on this recording wasn't the eccentric celebrity or the accused criminal. He was simply a human being in extraordinary pain, trying to make sense of why the world had turned against him when he'd spent his entire life trying to spread love and heal others through his art. The recording lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end, even the most skeptical person in the room had to acknowledge that they'd just heard something profound and deeply moving. But that was just the first tape. The second recording Dr. Chen prepared was labeled Songs They'll Never Let Me Release. This one began with music, and the moment the first notes played, everyone in the room recognized Michael's unmistakable vocal style. But the song itself was unlike anything he'd ever released publicly. The lyrics were overtly political, directly calling out corruption in the music industry. Names were mentioned. Specific incidents were described in metaphor that anyone familiar with industry gossip would immediately understand. The song was called They Own the Night, and it told the story of powerful men who controlled not just music but entire narrative structures around celebrity and scandal. Michael's voice soared over a dark, haunting melody that incorporated elements of rock, soul, and something that sounded almost like a funeral dirge. The production quality was immaculate, clearly a fully finished song rather than a demo. In the bridge, Michael's voice dropped to nearly a whisper as he sang about children lost in the machine, about dreams sold and souls purchased, about the real cost of empire building in the entertainment world. The tape contained 7 complete songs in total, each one exploring themes that would have been absolutely impossible for Michael to release during his lifetime. One song, titled The Mirror in the Mansion, seemed to be about wealthy elites hosting gatherings where innocence was destroyed. Another, called Industry Blues, laid out the financial manipulation that kept artists in debt despite massive sales. These weren't just protest songs. They were accusations set to music, testimony delivered through melody. Dr. Chen explained to the group that the recording quality and production techniques indicated these songs had been professionally recorded in a high-end studio, probably during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Someone had invested significant money and time into producing these tracks properly. They weren't rough demos recorded in a home studio. They were radio-ready, chart-worthy productions that had been deliberately kept hidden from the world. The implication was staggering. Michael had created an entire secret album of music that served as an alternative testimony to what was really happening in his life and in the industry around him. The third set of recordings proved to be even more explosive. These tapes contained phone conversations that Michael had recorded with permission from the other parties. In California, it was legal to record phone conversations as long as all parties knew they were being recorded, and Michael's voice at the beginning of each tape clearly stated, "This call is being recorded for legal purposes." The conversations included discussions with lawyers, managers, and other music industry figures about deals, contracts, and in some cases, alleged pressure tactics being used against Michael and other artists. One particularly significant conversation was between Michael and a former business manager, recorded in 1995. The manager could be heard explaining in casual terms how routine it was to use offshore accounts to hide royalties from artists, how contracts were deliberately written to be confusing, how audits were discouraged through intimidation. The manager seemed to assume Michael was aware of and complicit in these practices, but Michael's questions on the tape made it clear he was actually documenting the admission. He asked for clarification on specific techniques, requested that certain statements be repeated, essentially conducting an informal deposition disguised as a business conversation. Another conversation featured a confrontation with a producer who'd worked on one of Michael's albums. Michael could be heard accusing the producer of taking kickbacks from equipment rental companies, inflating production costs, and pocketing the difference. The producer initially denied it, but, as Michael presented specific financial documents over the phone, eventually admitted to the scheme. He tried to justify it by saying everyone in the industry did it, that it was just how business worked. Michael's response was ice cold. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't make it right. This ends now, or these recordings go to the authorities. The legal implications of these recorded conversations were staggering. If authenticated and proven admissible in court, they could potentially trigger criminal investigations into financial crimes that fell well within the statute of limitations. Some of the people heard on these recordings were still active in the music industry, still managing major artists, still wielding enormous influence. The question of what to do with this evidence was becoming more pressing by the hour. As the team worked through more tapes, a picture began to emerge of Michael Jackson as something far more complex than his public image suggested. He hadn't been naive or childlike in his business dealings. He'd been intensely aware of the corruption around him and had systematically documented it. The persona he projected, the soft-spoken, almost wounded creative genius, had provided him cover to observe and record without being taken seriously as a threat. It was an incredible piece of long-term strategic thinking. But perhaps the most emotionally affecting recordings were the ones Michael had made for his children. There were 3 tapes, one addressed to each of his kids, to be opened when they reached adulthood. In these recordings, Michael's voice was filled with love, hope, and barely concealed worry. He talked about what he hoped for their futures, about lessons he'd learned that he wanted to pass on. He warned them about the dangers of fame, about people who would pretend to be friends but would really only want access to the Jackson name and fortune. He encouraged them to be strong, to be kind, to remember that real power came from integrity rather than influence. In Prince's tape, Michael talked about the pressure of being the oldest, about leadership and responsibility. In Paris's recording, he spoke about being a young woman in a world that would constantly judge her appearance and behavior, encouraging her to define herself rather than accepting others' definitions. In Blanket's tape, Michael spoke about identity and finding your own path when the world has expectations based on your family name. These recordings revealed Michael as a thoughtful, present father desperately trying to prepare his children for a world that would treat them differently because of who their father was. By the end of the second day of reviewing audio materials, the team had gone through only about half of the recordings. Yet already, they'd uncovered enough material to fill books, to fuel documentaries, to potentially trigger multiple investigations. The question weighing on everyone's mind was becoming impossible to ignore. What exactly should be done with all of this information? Michael had clearly wanted it discovered eventually, but he'd also understood the explosive nature of what he'd compiled. His final wishes would need to be balanced against legal requirements, family privacy concerns, and the potential for real justice in cases where wrongdoing had been systematically covered up for decades. On the third day of examination, the team turned their attention to the photographs and journals that had been meticulously preserved in Michael's titanium time capsule. Sarah Martinez carefully removed the first leather-bound journal, its cover worn from repeated handling but the pages inside immaculately preserved. The journal was dated 1985, the year that saw Michael the absolute peak of his commercial success. What was written inside would prove to be a heartbreaking counterpoint to the public triumph everyone remembered. The journal entries revealed a young man completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own success. Michael wrote about the suffocating nature of fame, describing how he couldn't walk down a street, couldn't shop in a store, couldn't have a normal conversation without it becoming a global news event. He detailed anxiety attacks that left him gasping for air in hotel rooms, panic episodes that struck during performances, and the crushing loneliness that came from never knowing if people loved him for himself or for what he represented. One particularly devastating entry described him sitting alone in a massive mansion the night of his 27th birthday, surrounded by gold records and awards, wondering if anyone actually knew who he really was beneath the image. But the journals weren't just personal emotional processing. Michael had used them to document specific incidents and observations with journalistic precision. He wrote about meetings where he'd been the only artist in a room full of executives, listening to them discuss marketing strategies that treated human beings like products to be packaged and sold. He documented conversations where people casually discussed destroying careers, spreading rumors, and manipulating media narratives to serve business interests. His entries included names, dates, locations, and often his own analysis of what power dynamics were really at play in each situation. One journal from 1993, the year his life began its most dramatic downward spiral, contained entries that were almost painful to read. Michael wrote about the first accusation, his complete shock and disbelief that anyone could interpret his love for children as something sinister. He described the advice he'd received from lawyers and handlers to settle the case rather than fight it, even though settlement would be seen as an admission of guilt. He wrote furiously about being trapped between two impossible choices: spend years in court defending his innocence while the media convicted him daily, or pay money to make the accusation go away and live forever under the cloud of suspicion. The anguish in his words was palpable. The photographs accompanying the journals added visual context to Michael's written words. There were candid shots taken at parties and industry events, showing Michael standing slightly apart from groups of people who were clearly networking and making deals. His body language in these photos told a story all its own: arms crossed, slightly turned away, a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. These weren't the carefully posed professional photographs the public knew. These were moments captured when Michael thought no one was paying attention, revealing a man who seemed to exist at the margins of his own spectacular life. More disturbing were photographs that appeared to have been taken surreptitiously at various industry parties and gatherings. These images showed powerful entertainment figures in compromising situations, intoxicated, behaving inappropriately, in settings that suggested the kind of excess and boundary crossing that Michael had written about in his letters. Each photograph was carefully labeled with date, location, and context notes in Michael's handwriting. It became clear that Michael had been deliberately documenting the darker side of Hollywood's elite culture, creating visual evidence to corroborate what he'd written in his journals and letters. One series of photographs particularly caught Sarah's attention. They showed a young performer, someone who'd been famous in the early 1990s but had later disappeared from public life entirely, at what appeared to be a Hollywood party. The progression of images told a troubling story. In the first photos, the young performer looked alert and happy. In subsequent images, the person appeared increasingly disoriented and distressed. The final photo in the sequence showed the performer being led away by two older men, clearly unable to walk without support. Michael's note beneath the photos read, "Tried to intervene, was told to mind my own business, called the next day to check, told the person was fine and not to worry. Read 3 years later that this person had a complete breakdown and never performed again. I should have done more. I didn't do enough. The journals from the 2000s took on a different tone. Michael's writing became more philosophical, more focused on legacy and meaning rather than day-to-day observations. He wrote extensively about his children, about the kind of father he wanted to be versus the kind of upbringing he'd experienced. He described his struggle to provide his kids with normal childhoods while also preparing them for the reality that they would always be Michael Jackson's children. There were entries about taking them on regular outings in disguise, about reading to them at night, about the small moment of connection that meant more to him than any amount of commercial success ever had. But even these later journals contained disturbing material. Michael wrote about receiving threats, about people approaching him with knowledge of what he'd documented over the years. He described being warned to leave the past alone, to stop asking questions about things that didn't concern him. There were references to mysterious car accidents, to sudden illnesses that seemed suspicious, to other performers who'd asked too many questions and found themselves blacklisted or worse. Michael's paranoia, which the media had mocked for years, suddenly seemed entirely rational given what he'd been documenting. One journal entry from early 2009, just months before his death, was particularly chilling. Michael wrote about the pressure surrounding his planned comeback tour. He described feeling physically and emotionally unprepared for the demanding schedule that had been announced without his full approval. He wrote about conflict with management over the number of shows, about his concerns regarding his health, about a sense that he was being pushed towards something that could hurt him. Most significantly, he wrote, "If something happens to me, look beyond the obvious. I made enemies in high places. I've kept records they'd rather not see made public. I hope this is just my imagination, my paranoia playing tricks. But if I'm right, if something does happen, the truth is in the box. Let it out when the time is right." Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a forensic psychiatrist who'd been brought onto the team, reviewed the journals with particular attention to Michael's mental state. Her assessment was sobering. She explained that while Michael clearly struggled with depression and anxiety, his thinking was largely rational and his observations were detailed and consistent in a way that didn't suggest delusion or paranoia. His fears, she concluded, were based on real experiences rather than imagined threats. The journals of someone experiencing true paranoid delusions would show thought patterns very different from what Michael had documented. His writing suggested hypervigilance born of actual danger rather than imagined persecution. Among the photographs was a small envelope containing what appeared to be family pictures that Michael had kept private. These images showed him at his most relaxed and genuine, playing with his children, laughing with his mother, interacting with siblings during quiet family moments. These weren't the stiff, formal family portraits that had been released to the media over the years. They were the kind of casual snapshots that any family might have, except the subject happened to be one of the most famous people on Earth. The contrast between Michael in these private photos and the public persona he'd maintained was striking. In his family pictures, he looked like any other person, any other father, any other son trying to maintain connections despite extraordinary circumstances. The final journal in the collection was different from all the others. It wasn't chronological or focused on specific events. Instead, it appeared to be Michael's attempt to make sense of his entire life, to find meaning and purpose in all the pain and complexity he'd experienced. He wrote about forgiveness, about how harboring anger had been poisonous to his spirit. He wrote about redemption, about hoping that his documentation of wrongdoing might lead to positive change in an industry he'd loved despite its cruelty. Most poignantly, he wrote about hope that his children would live better lives, hope that future young performers might be protected by reforms his revelation could inspire, hope that people would eventually understand he'd been trying to do good in a world that constantly misunderstood his intentions. The last entry in this final journal was dated June 24, 2009, the day before Michael's death. It read simply, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm at peace. I've done my best to document truth. I've tried to protect those who came after me. I've loved my children with everything I have. If this is all I get, these 50 years, then I hope I've made them count. To whoever finds this, please use it wisely. The point isn't revenge. The point is justice, truth, and hopefully prevention. Make the industry better. Protect the children. Remember me as I really was, not as the caricature. That's all I ask." As Sarah closed the final journal, she looked around at the assembled team. Every person in the room had been transformed by what they'd witnessed over the past 3 days. They'd come expecting to find interesting artifacts from a celebrity's life. Instead, they discovered a comprehensive archive of one man's attempt to bear witness to truth in an industry built on carefully constructed illusions. The weight of responsibility for what to do with all this information was crushing. The decision of what to do with Michael Jackson's hidden archive created a firestorm that extended far beyond the examination room at Forest Lawn. Legal teams representing the Jackson estate, potential subject of Michael's allegations, and various media organizations all demanded access or suppression depending on their interests. Meanwhile, as rumors spread about the discovery, public pressure mounted for transparency. Fans who defended Michael for years wanted vindication. Critics wanted to scrutinize the authenticity of the materials. The world, it seemed, had stopped waiting patiently for carefully managed information releases and was demanding immediate answers. Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of an ethical tornado. As the lead investigator, she had access to everything in that titanium box, and she understood better than anyone else the magnitude of what they discovered. The evidence Michael had compiled wasn't just personally meaningful to his legacy. It had the potential to trigger criminal investigations, to expose systematic abuse and corruption, to fundamentally change how the entertainment industry operated. But it also had the potential to destroy lives, some possibly innocent despite Michael's suspicions. The burden of determining how and what to release was extraordinary. The Jackson family was deeply divided. Some members wanted everything made public immediately, believing that only complete transparency would honor Michael's memory and intentions. They argued that Michael had gone to incredible lengths to ensure these materials survived his death, and suppressing them would be the ultimate betrayal. Other family members worried about the impact on Michael's children, about dredging up painful memories and accusations that had already caused unspeakable suffering. They questioned whether Michael, if he'd lived to see 2023, would really want all of this exposed in the social media age where nuance and context often disappeared in the rush to judgment and viral outrage. After weeks of debate, a compromise was reached. A team of independent investigators, journalists, and legal experts would be given full access to Michael's archive. They would have 6 months to verify everything, to cross-reference allegations with other available evidence, to interview relevant parties, and to prepare a comprehensive report. Simultaneously, a documentary team would be given limited supervised access to create a film that would contextualize Michael's findings within his life story. The goal was to ensure that truth emerged carefully and responsibly rather than in fragments that could be manipulated or misunderstood. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in scope. Forensic accountants began tracing the financial schemes Michael had documented, finding that many of his allegations about contract manipulation and royalty theft were disturbingly accurate. Pattern after pattern of young artists being exploited by predatory contracts emerged from their analysis. Some of the specific cases Michael had written about led directly to discoveries of similar exploitation of other artists. Music industry reform advocates seized on these findings, using them to push for legislative changes to how artists, especially young ones, were protected in contractual relationships. Investigators looking into Michael's more serious allegations about misconduct at Hollywood parties found corroborating evidence in some cases. Several people who had been young performers during the periods Michael wrote about came forward with their own stories after learning about the archive. They described experiences that matched Michael's observations, lending credibility to his documentation. Some of these revelations led to renewed investigations of incidents that had been dismissed or covered up decades earlier. The recordings proved to be particularly powerful evidence. Audio engineers confirmed that the tapes hadn't been tampered with or edited deceptively. The conversations Michael had preserved demonstrated clear admissions of financial impropriety in several cases. Multiple individuals heard on those recordings suddenly found themselves facing difficult questions from journalists, law enforcement, and professional ethics boards. Some retired quietly from the industry. Others hired aggressive legal teams to fight the allegations. A few, surprisingly, acknowledged their past behavior and expressed regret, saying that the industry culture of the time had normalized practices they now recognize as harmful and wrong. Michael's secret album of unreleased songs created its own sensation. Music critics who reviewed the tracks were nearly unanimous in their assessment that these were some of the most powerful and artistically mature works Michael had ever created. The production quality rivaled anything from his classic albums, and the lyrics demonstrated a depth and political consciousness that the public had rarely associated with him. Several prominent artists expressed interest in covering the songs or collaborating on modern versions that could bring Michael's message to contemporary audiences. The question of whether to release these recordings commercially became another point of heated debate. The most emotionally resonant aspect of the revelation was how it transformed public understanding of Michael Jackson himself. For years, the narrative around him had been dominated by scandal, eccentricity, and tragedy. People remember the bizarre behavior, the allegations, the physical transformation, the spectacular downfall. But the contents of that hidden box revealed a much more complete and complex human being. Here was a man who'd been intensely aware of the corruption around him, who'd documented wrongdoing at personal risk, who'd struggled with trauma while trying to protect others from similar experiences. The childlike persona everyone had mocked suddenly seemed like an intentional shield, a way to survive in an environment that could destroy anyone who appeared too threatening. Sarah Martinez watched as the story unfolded across media platforms worldwide. The documentary that premiered 9 months after the discovery became one of the most-watched programs in television history. It carefully presented Michael's findings alongside expert analysis and contemporary context. The filmmakers had done exactly what Michael seemed to have hoped for. They used his documentation not as tabloid fodder but as a foundation for a serious examination of entertainment industry practices and the human cost of fame. The response was overwhelming. Viewers around the world expressed shock, sympathy, and anger at what had been revealed. Perhaps most significantly, Michael's archive sparked genuine industry reform. Major recording labels announced new contract review procedures designed to protect young artists. Professional organizations established oversight committees to investigate exploitation claims. Several high-profile figures who'd been implicated in Michael's documentation faced professional consequences, with some losing positions of power they'd held for decades. It wasn't perfect or complete justice, but it represented meaningful change inspired directly by Michael's decision to document truth rather than accept silence. The Jackson family's response evolved as they watched the impact of Michael's revelation unfold. His children, now adults, released a statement expressing pride in their father's courage and integrity. They wrote about growing up knowing he'd been misunderstood, about the private man who'd been so different from his public image. They thanked him for trying to make the industry safer for future generations of young performers. The statement was dignified, loving, and free of bitterness, exactly the kind of grace Michael had hoped to instill in them. Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, then in her 90s, gave a rare interview about the discovery. She spoke about always knowing her son had a good heart, about never doubting his intentions even when the world seemed determined to see him as guilty. She described the relief of finally having concrete evidence that supported what she'd always known in her heart. She also spoke about forgiveness, echoing Michael's own words from his final journal. The point wasn't to destroy people out of revenge, she explained. The point was to expose truth so that healing and change could happen. Her wisdom and compassion reminded everyone why Michael had been so devoted to her throughout his life. The conspiracy theories about Michael's death, which had circulated in certain corners of the internet for years, gained new credibility after the archive's revelation. While investigators couldn't definitively prove foul play, they acknowledged that Michael's documentation had indeed made him a potential threat to powerful interests. The circumstances surrounding his death were re-examined with fresh scrutiny. Some evidence that had seemed insignificant at the time took on new meaning in light of what was now known about the pressure Michael had been under. The official cause of death remained unchanged, but a shadow of doubt had been permanently cast over the simple narrative of accidental overdose. Sarah Martinez eventually wrote her own account of the investigation, a detailed book that became a bestseller and won numerous journalism awards. In it, she reflected on what the experience had taught her about fame, power, and the price of truth-telling. She wrote about Michael Jackson as one of the most misunderstood figures she'd ever encountered in her career, a person whose genuine oddity had been weaponized against him while his legitimate observations about industry corruption had been dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a damaged celebrity. Her book helped cement the revised understanding of Michael's life and legacy that was emerging in popular consciousness. The impact on Michael Jackson's artistic legacy was profound. Retrospectives of his work began emphasizing not just his musical genius, but his role as an observer and documenter of his era's darker realities. Music scholars analyzed his released work through the lens of what they now knew about his awareness of industry corruption, finding subtle references and metaphors they previously missed. His humanitarian work was recontextualized as part of a larger pattern of trying to protect vulnerable people from the kinds of exploitation he'd witnessed and experienced. His entire life story was being rewritten from villain or victim to complicated truth-teller. 3 years after the discovery, Forest Lawn Memorial Park installed a new memorial near Michael's resting place. It featured selected quotes from his journals about hope, redemption, and the power of truth. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for fans who wanted to honor not just the entertainer they'd loved, but the complicated, courageous human being they'd come to know through his hidden archive. People left flowers, letters, and often their own stories of struggling to be heard and believed in situations where power protected wrongdoing. Michael's grave had become a symbol of something larger than celebrity. It represented the possibility that truth could eventually emerge even when powerful forces tried to suppress it. The titanium box itself, empty now of its explosive contents, was placed in a museum devoted to Michael Jackson's life and legacy. Visitors could see the actual container that had preserved his secrets for 14 years, could read the inscription he'd etched onto its surface, could contemplate the determination and foresight required to create such an elaborate insurance policy against his own erasure. The box became an artifact that told its own story about a man who'd understood that death might come for him, but was determined that the truth would survive. As Sarah stood in that museum 5 years after the initial discovery, looking at the titanium box behind a protective glass, she reflected on how dramatically one object had changed so many lives. Michael Jackson's hidden truth hadn't just revealed industry corruption or vindicated a controversial figure. It had sparked a global conversation about power, exploitation, and the courage required to speak truth even when silence would be safer. It had reminded the world that the people we dismiss as eccentric or damaged might be seeing things more clearly than those who appear normal and successful. The final word on Michael's revelation perhaps belonged to one of the young artists who'd come forward with corroborating stories after learning about the archive. This person, now a successful performer and advocate for industry reform, said in an interview, "Michael Jackson spent his whole life being called weird, being mocked for his behavior, being questioned about his sanity. It turns out he was the sanest person in the room. He was the one actually seeing reality while everyone else was playing pretend. He documented the truth when it would have been easier and safer to look away. That's not crazy. That's courage. That's integrity. That's exactly the kind of person we should have been listening to all along." And with those words, perhaps the transformation was complete. Michael Jackson had entered his grave as a tragic, controversial figure whose legacy seemed permanently tainted by scandal and suffering. But through his own foresight and determination, through that hidden titanium box and its carefully preserved contents, he'd emerged in death as something quite different. A witness, a truth-teller, a man who tried despite impossible odds to make things better. The king of pop had become something more important than royalty. He'd become a reminder that truth, however long buried, has a way of fighting its way back into the light. The world would never forget Michael Jackson the entertainer. But now, thanks to what had been hidden in his grave, the world would also remember Michael Jackson the person, flawed, complicated, wounded, but ultimately committed to leaving behind something more valuable than music. He'd left a roadmap to understanding not just his own life, but the hidden machinery of fame itself. And in doing so, he'd given one final, extraordinary performance, transforming death into revelation, silence into testimony, and a grave into a time capsule that would change history. His truth, hidden for 14 years in darkness, had finally been revealed to the world. And the world, slowly but surely, was listening at last.